Philadelphia, November 1953. Grace Kelly was going through her late grandfather's papers when she found the leather-bound journal hidden behind a false wall in the family mansion's library. She had been looking for old photographs for a magazine article about her family's success story. What she discovered instead would haunt her for the rest of her life. The journal contained detailed records of her family's business dealings from the 1920s, dealings that had nothing to do with construction or legitimate enterprises. Her grandfather, John B. Kelly Sr., hadn't built the family fortune through hard work and determination like everyone believed. He had built it on blood money. The pages revealed a horrific truth. The Kelly family wealth came from a crime so terrible that Grace's grandfather had spent decades covering it up, a crime that had destroyed innocent lives and left families devastated. As Grace read entry after entry, her hands trembling, she realized that everything she had ever been told about her family was a lie. The Kelly name, the Olympic medals, the construction empire, the social standing, all of it was built on a foundation of guilt and deception. But the worst part wasn't learning about her grandfather's crime. It was discovering that her father knew, and he had been using the blood money to finance Grace's Hollywood career. Every movie, every contract, every opportunity that had made Grace Kelly a star, it was all paid for with money that had cost innocent people their lives. To understand the full horror of what Grace discovered, you need to know about Philadelphia in the 1920s. It was the height of Prohibition, and the city was controlled by violent gangs who made fortunes smuggling alcohol. Grace's grandfather, John B. Kelly Sr., was known publicly as a successful construction contractor and Olympic rowing champion. But according to the journal Grace found, he had a secret partnership with one of the most ruthless bootleggers in Philadelphia, a man named Vincent the Hammer DeMarco. Kelly provided legitimate businesses as fronts for DeMarco's illegal operations. Construction sites became hiding places for smuggled alcohol. Kelly's trucks transported bootleg liquor disguised as building materials. Kelly's warehouses stored illegal alcohol that was distributed throughout the East Coast. In return, DeMarco paid Kelly enormous sums of money that Kelly used to expand his construction empire and establish the family fortune. But the partnership went far beyond simple bootlegging. The journal entries that made Grace physically sick described something much worse. In March 1924, a rival gang tried to muscle in on DeMarco's territory. The leader was a man named Tommy Torino, who controlled alcohol distribution in South Philadelphia. According to her grandfather's journal, Kelly helped DeMarco plan Torino's elimination. Kelly used his construction company to dig what appeared to be a foundation for a new building, but it was actually a mass grave. On the night of March 15, 1924, DeMarco's men lured Torino and 6 of his associates to a meeting at one of Kelly's construction sites. They were all murdered and buried in the foundation Kelly had prepared. The next day, Kelly's workers poured concrete over the grave, and within weeks, a legitimate office building stood over the bodies of 7 men. Grace found photographs in the journal, pictures of the murder site, pictures of her grandfather shaking hands with DeMarco over the fresh concrete, pictures of the briefcase full of money that DeMarco paid Kelly for his help. But the horror didn't end there. Grace discovered that her grandfather had kept detailed records of every family that DeMarco's gang had destroyed. Wives left widowed, children left fatherless, businesses destroyed when their owners refused to pay protection money. John B. Kelly Sr. had been an accessory to at least 30 murders between 1922 and 1930. Every expansion of his construction business, every social advancement of the Kelly family, every privilege Grace had enjoyed growing up, all of it was built on a foundation of death and destruction. The journal's final entries were the most devastating. In 1930, when Prohibition ended and the partnership with DeMarco was no longer profitable, Kelly made a decision that revealed the true depths of his callousness. Vincent DeMarco had become a liability. He knew too much about Kelly's involvement in the murders, and he was beginning to drink heavily and talk too much in public. So Kelly arranged for DeMarco's death. He invited DeMarco to inspect a new construction project, a bridge being built over the Delaware River. Kelly's workers had been instructed to leave a section of the bridge railing incomplete. When DeMarco arrived, Kelly walked him to the edge of the bridge to admire the view. Then Kelly pushed his former partner into the river. DeMarco couldn't swim. He drowned while Kelly watched from above. The journal's final entry was dated December 31, 1930. Vincent is gone. The past is buried. The Kelly family is safe forever. No one will ever know the truth about how we built our empire. Grace sat in the library for hours after reading the journal, unable to move, unable to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. Her grandfather wasn't just a criminal, he was a mass murderer, and her father, Jack Kelly Jr., knew about it. Grace remembered conversations from her childhood that suddenly made terrible sense. Times when her father had received mysterious phone calls that made him pale and nervous. Times when strangers had come to the house demanding to speak with her father privately. Times when her father had made large, unexplained donations to Catholic charities. Her father had been trying to buy forgiveness for his family's sins. But worse than learning about her grandfather's crimes was realizing how those crimes had shaped her own life. Grace remembered being 12 years old and asking her father why they were so much wealthier than their neighbors. Her father had told her that hard work and determination were the Kelly family's secrets to success. It was a lie. The real Kelly family secret was murder. When Grace was 15 and dreaming of becoming an actress, her father had hired the best acting coaches money could buy. He had used his connections to get Grace auditions and opportunities that other young actresses could only dream of. Grace had always wondered how her father, a construction contractor from Philadelphia, had such powerful connections in Hollywood. Now she knew. The Kelly family's blood money had bought those connections. Every step of Grace's rise to stardom had been financed by the murders her grandfather had committed 30 years earlier. The beautiful gowns she wore to premieres, the luxurious apartment she lived in during her early Hollywood days, the acting coaches who had refined her craft, all of it had been paid for with money that had cost innocent people their lives. Grace realized that she had never earned anything on her own merit. Her talent might have been real, but the opportunities to showcase that talent had been purchased with blood money. The revelation destroyed Grace's sense of self. Everything she thought she knew about her identity, her family, her achievements, all of it was built on a foundation of lies and murder. Grace confronted her father the next day. She found him in his study reading the morning paper, looking like the successful, respectable businessman he pretended to be. "Dad," Grace said quietly, placing the journal on his desk. "We need to talk." Jack Kelly Sr. looked at the journal and his face went white. He had hoped this day would never come. "Grace," he said carefully, "where did you find that?" "Hidden in grandfather's library, behind a false wall." Grace's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "Is it true? Is everything in here true?" Her father was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, it's all true." Grace felt the world spinning around her. Part of her had hoped that the journal was some kind of elaborate fiction, that her grandfather had been writing crime stories rather than confessing to actual murders. "How could you know about this and never tell me?" Grace asked. "I was protecting you," her father said. "I was protecting our entire family." "Protecting us?" "Dad, you've been using murder money to finance my career. You've made me an accessory to everything grandfather did." Her father looked stricken. "Grace, you're not responsible for what happened before you were born, but I'm responsible for what I've done with the benefits of those crimes," Grace said. "Every role I've gotten, every opportunity I've had, it's all been built on blood money." Jack Kelly Sr. tried to justify his actions. He explained that he had been using the family's wealth to do good in the world. He donated millions to charities. He supported causes that helped the poor and disadvantaged. He was trying to balance the scales. But Grace wasn't consoled. "Dad, you can't undo murder with charity work. You can't balance the scales when the crimes are that horrible." "Then what do you want me to do?" her father asked desperately. "Do you want me to confess? Do you want me to destroy our family's reputation? Do you want me to go to prison?" Grace considered this. Part of her wanted to march to the police station and confess everything. But she also understood that her father was right about one thing: confessing would destroy everyone in the Kelly family. Her younger siblings would be humiliated. Her mother, who knew nothing about the journal, would be devastated. The Kelly name, which had become synonymous with success and respectability in Philadelphia, would be forever associated with murder and corruption. Grace made a decision that would torment her for the rest of her life. She decided to keep the family secret. But she also decided that she could never again accept anything from her family's tainted wealth. Grace returned to Hollywood with a secret that was eating her alive. She threw herself into her work with a desperation that her colleagues noticed but couldn't understand. Grace became obsessed with proving that she could succeed on her own merit, without any help from her family's blood money. She refused financial support from her father. She moved out of the luxury apartment he had been paying for and into a modest studio apartment that she could afford on her own salary. She began giving away most of her earnings to charity, particularly to organizations that helped families of crime victims. It was Grace's way of trying to atone for her grandfather's sins. Grace's friends noticed the change in her. She had always been serious and dedicated, but now she seemed haunted. She would sometimes stare off into space during conversations, lost in thoughts that seemed to cause her physical pain. Alfred Hitchcock, who directed Grace in 3 films, later said that Grace's performances after 1953 had a depth of anguish that hadn't been there before. She was carrying some terrible burden. Hitchcock recalled in a 1975 interview, "You could see it in her eyes. There was a sadness there that made her more compelling on screen, but I always wondered what had caused it." The burden Grace was carrying was the knowledge that her entire career had been built on her grandfather's crimes. Every time she walked on a movie set, every time she performed in front of a camera, she was reminded that her opportunities had been purchased with blood money. Grace began having nightmares about the families her grandfather had destroyed. She would dream about the widows and orphans who had been left behind when DeMarco's gang murdered their husbands and fathers. In her dreams, these victims would confront Grace, asking her why she was living in luxury while they had suffered in poverty. Grace would try to explain that she hadn't known about the crimes, that she was innocent. But the dream victims would point out that she was benefiting from their suffering, that her success was built on their pain. Grace would wake up from these nightmares in a cold sweat, unable to return to sleep. The guilt began affecting Grace's physical health. She lost weight. She developed insomnia. She started experiencing panic attacks during filming. Grace's decision to marry Prince Rainier of Monaco in 1956 was influenced by more than just love. It was also an escape from the guilt that was consuming her. By becoming Princess Grace of Monaco, she could leave behind Grace Kelly, the Hollywood actress, the person whose career had been financed by blood money. She could start fresh with a new identity in a new country. But the guilt followed Grace to Monaco. Even as Princess Grace, living in a palace thousands of miles from Philadelphia, Grace couldn't escape the knowledge of what her family had done. She continued to have nightmares about her grandfather's victims. She continued to donate large portions of her royal allowance to charities that helped crime victims. Grace's children later said that their mother would sometimes become melancholy for no apparent reason. She would stare out the palace windows at the Mediterranean Sea and seem lost in sad thoughts. What they didn't know was that Grace was thinking about the families her grandfather had destroyed. She was wondering if any descendants of those victims were still alive, still suffering from the consequences of crimes committed decades earlier. In 1976, Grace made a secret trip to Philadelphia. She spent 3 days researching the families mentioned in her grandfather's journal, trying to find out what had happened to the wives and children of the men her grandfather had helped murder. What Grace discovered made her guilt even worse. Most of the families had never recovered from their losses. Without their breadwinners, many had fallen into poverty. Some of the widows had been forced to give up their children to orphanages. Some of the children had turned to crime themselves, perpetuating cycles of violence and desperation. Grace realized that her grandfather's crimes had destroyed not just the immediate victims but entire family lines for generations. Grace returned to Monaco determined to find a way to make amends. She began secretly funneling money to the descendants of her grandfather's victims. She used private investigators to track down survivors and arrange for anonymous donations that helped pay for education, medical care, and housing. Grace spent millions of dollars over the years trying to undo the damage her grandfather had caused. But she knew it could never be enough. The guilt Grace carried affected her relationship with her own children. She was overprotective, constantly worried that some form of cosmic justice would punish her family for her grandfather's crimes. Grace insisted that Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie be raised with strong moral values and a deep sense of responsibility for helping others. She wanted to ensure that the Kelly family legacy would eventually be one of redemption rather than destruction. But Grace never told her children the truth about their Philadelphia grandfather. She couldn't bear the thought of passing the burden of guilt to the next generation. Grace Kelly died in 1982, taking the family secret to her grave, but those who knew her best said that she had never found peace with what she had learned in her grandfather's journal. Grace's final charity donations, made just weeks before her death, were to organizations that helped families of homicide victims. Even in her final days, she was trying to atone for crimes committed decades before her birth. After Grace's death, her assistant found a letter she had written but never sent. It was addressed to the families of Vincent DeMarco's victims and dated 1953, just days after Grace had discovered her grandfather's journal. The letter read, I have recently learned that my family's wealth was built on crimes that destroyed innocent lives. I cannot undo what my grandfather did, but I want you to know that his crimes have haunted me every day since I learned of them. I have tried to use the privileges his blood money gave me to help others, but I know it will never be enough. I am sorry. I am so deeply, desperately sorry for what my family did to yours. Grace Kelly. The letter was never sent because Grace could never figure out how to locate the victims' families without revealing the truth about her grandfather's crimes. Grace Kelly lived with the guilt of her family's blood money for 29 years. The secret poisoned every achievement, every happiness, every moment of success. The woman the world saw as the epitome of grace and elegance was actually tormented by knowledge that would have destroyed her if it had ever been made public. Grace's story is a reminder that some family secrets are too terrible to bear alone, and that the sins of previous generations can cast shadows that last for decades. The Kelly family fortune still exists today, supporting various charities and causes, but it was built on a foundation of murder and corruption that Grace Kelly spent her entire adult life trying to atone for. If this story moved you, share it with others who understand that guilt can be inherited and that redemption requires facing the truth about our past. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments, should Grace have exposed her grandfather's crimes? Don't miss our next video where we reveal another shocking truth about Grace Kelly's tormented life, the real reason she could never find happiness even as a princess. Remember, sometimes the price of family loyalty is carrying burdens that aren't ours to bear. Grace Kelly spent her life paying for crimes she never committed but couldn't escape.